My name is Alex Castano, and I'm the events coordinator at the Clearwater Historical Society. Today we'll be having Dr. Gary Mormino, and he will be speaking today about 10 Florida foods, so I hope you enjoy this presentation. Thank you.
Welcome, Clearwater Historical Society, virtually. My name is Gary Mormino, and I'm delighted to be here. I've been teaching a food history class for about 10, 12 years. I don't think anyone is trained in food history. And looking back at my career, I was always fascinated with food, but really didn't, and I would keep notes on it, but really wasn't sure what to do with it. And sometime probably 20, 25 years ago, it became a bona fide, legitimate class. It kind of first led by anthropologists and that. But if you think about it, food history is the perfect medium. Almost everything we do touches food. So where we live, the geography of food, what you can grow, immigration, war, ethnicity, family traditions, etc., holidays. Food is kind of a touchstone. So I teach a class on food history at USF St. Pete, and it's one of the more interesting classes because the students now, most of the students, I typically teach the class in the honor program. Most of the students are children of immigrants because they all want to be engineers and physicians. So it's fascinating to see them bring their food traditions there. So this is going to focus on Florida, which is my specialty. So let's take a look. This is a weird introduction to food history, but maybe you'll see where. First of all, almost no one has ever answered the question, what crop are they picking? These are three women in Fort Myers, 1950. What crop? It's not necessarily a food, although you can eat it. I've checked it out. And if it were in color, it would probably be easier.
Is it a grain?
No. Almost everyone first guesses sugar cane. It is. My grandfather, my immigrant grandfather, cut sugar cane in Napoleonville, Louisiana, and sugar cane is 10 feet tall, and more bamboo-like than that. Those are gladiolas.
Oh.
Now, there's an extra credit. Who can spell gladiola? So, what's my point? That gladiolas were once a crop in Fort Myers. And what's even more interesting is the backstory of this. I was giving a talk about 10 years ago at the Sanibel Audubon Club. And I find this, and we go there, and there must be 300 people there. And not a single person could answer what crop are they picking. And I told them that these were gladiolas, and in fact, as you drive into Sanibel, what road do you travel? Gladiola Boulevard.
Oh.
And yet there's no connection. This is classic Florida, classic American. The past is kind of shredded. And I've always understood that the gladiola belt in Florida went from the Iona Peninsula in Fort Myers to Clearwater.
Yep.
Anyone know whether gladiolas were grown here?
Yeah. Yes, right around.
You needed lots of water, and the reason gladiolas aren't grown is pretty simple. You know, you started picking tourists and condos. The flower is really a third industry. I mean, think third world industry. We get almost all of our flowers down from Colombia, which is probably a more interesting topic. So we begin with, I've always thought this would make the best movie or a book plot. I'm guessing few of you know the name Jacques Lemoyne. Jacques Lemoyne was a French Protestant, a Huguenot, who came to Florida in 1565 with an expedition to plant the French flag, more importantly, to plant Protestantism on American soil. And they chose the St. John's outlet there in present-day Jacksonville. Unbeknownst to them, that the Spaniards were about to plant their flag about 30 miles south of there in St. Augustine. They had just And this is the war, these are the religious wars of the 19th century. And the Spanish attacked the colony, and it was called Fort Caroline. It's now the St. Johns River. But they killed almost everyone. You could survive if you agreed to convert to Catholicism. Otherwise, they cut your throat. But Lemoyne was one of the very few who escaped. He returned, lived most of his life in Flanders, and was an artist. And when he returned to Europe, he recollected all of his memories. We're pretty sure he didn't grab his drawings and take them, but they're the first images of agriculture in the New World. And this is what's interesting. He remembered the native Indians there, the Timucuas, having the special feast on holidays. So he wrote, there's a time of year when the natives feast. For this purpose, they choose special cooks. Pretty modern as today. Now that's a weird, looks like pea porridge they're pouring out, but this has been colorized. And we're going to return to Lemoyne several times. This is, in fact, on the NPR coming over here, they were talking about this morning. Anyone know what the brew is right here? This is called the black drink. Anyone ever heard of the black drink?
Yeah.
This was, in effect, New World coffee. It's more like a tea, but it comes from the Yalpin holly tree, which is kind of the Christmas with the red, the very brittle leaves, very hard leaves with points. And you take the leaves, not the berries, interestingly enough, and you fry them, you bake them, crush them up when they look like tea, and pour hot water. What you have is an instant caffeine high. Not, like you can't imagine. Apparently it's the equivalent of 40 doses of espresso. It's that fortified. And you immediately throw up, but after throwing up, you gain this huge energy bowl. And the Latin name for the tree is Ilex vomitorium, which tells you something. And this is the black drink, and the black drink belt, that's what the Yalpin holly looks like. And I took out the slide. It's basically the southeast United States down through the Tampa Bay area, where the Yalpin holly. This is another plant that Lemoyne drew. This is called Kunti. The Latin name is Zamia floridana. And you see this all. I bet if we walked outside, you'd see this plant as a landscaping plant. You see it everywhere. And this makes the equivalent of their bread. There was no wheat in the New World. The wheat was brought there. But the natives used this plant to make what we would call today arrowroot. And you wouldn't use the leaves, but you would dig it up and use the roots. It looks like kind of long horseradishes or turnips. And if you took a bite out of the root, you would die. It's poisonous. However, they figured out, probably through prisoners of war, that if you ground it up, filtered it several times through water, and it dried out and looked like cornstarch or arrowroot. And they used this to thicken stews, to make... and in fact, there was a Kunti mill as late as World War I in Fort Lauderdale. And they discovered that soldiers who had been gassed in Europe in the Great War had trouble holding down food. But if they made a gruel made from Kunti, it was palatable. Now, this is your quiz. This is your multiple. So, what crop goes with what city?
Wow.
And today, if you think about this, other than a few things like Plant City, we're not much, well, we are an agricultural state, but particularly the specialty crops were once identified with the city. So Pine Island, how many of you know Pine Island? What's the crop? mangoes. I'm going to speed this along, but Monticello, it's not pronounced Monticello, but it's pecans.
Right.
Weewahitchka. Anyone been to Weewahitchka?
No.
It's in the Apalachicola River area. And if you've seen the movie Yuli's Gold,
Yes.
it's Tupelo honey, which only grows in swamps with Tupelo trees. Hastings, near St. Augustine. Potatoes.
Oh,
Potatoes. That, and the potatoes supplied the Flagler hotels there. LaBelle.
Green bean.
Swamp cabbage.
Ah.
How many of you have eaten swamp cabbage virtually out there? No, I see very few. How many of you have eaten hearts of palm?
Yeah.
It's the same thing.
Oh, okay.
Except you can charge $12 for a salad. It was hearts of palm. It's from the palm tree, which I'm guessing is grown outside here. It's the cabbage palm. You cut out the heart of the tree, and you have what looks like kind of a football-shaped hard squash. But you use it in salads. You can use it as you would use squash. And there's a swamp cabbage festival in LaBelle. Pompano Beach, which you associate now with condos. Pompano Beach was green beans.
Whoa.
The earliest nickname of the football team was the Pompano Beach Green Pickers. Bean pickers, that should be. Bean pickers. Ruskin and Immokalee, those are the two used to make tomatoes, actually. Mazarick Town.
I would say potatoes, but
Chickens.
Chicken.
These were Czech immigrants,
yes.
Slovak immigrants from today's Czechoslovakia. They came in the 1940s to grow chickens, to raise chickens. By the way, my mother raised chickens when I was a kid. We had about 60 Rhode Island Reds and Plymouth Whites. Zellwood,
Sweet corn.
kind of lost now. It's really but in fact, what you'll find that much of this talk deals with a vanished Florida. I mean, and finally, Homestead, avocados. Homestead is outside Miami, inland, and it never freezes there. So most of the tropical foliage in Florida is grown there. And really the only substantial avocado grows are in Homestead. 95% of our avocados come from Mexico. So you didn't do well, by the way.
no.
And Sarasota, by the way, is also, you think, what do you associate with Sarasota then? Art, culture.
Yeah.
These are the Bertha Palmer celery fields.
Oh my God.
You think when the last exit to go to Sarasota is called, it's an agricultural name, what? It will come to me later. Anyway, celery. In fact, the celery is also associated with Sanford, Florida. The class ring in Sanford, Florida used to have celery leaves as kind of a filigree on the ring. That's Sanford. Largo, think of this. I think this is one of the best photos. This is 1895. They wanted to photograph kind of the Pinellas Peninsula before the railroad came. And they went to Largo. Now, I don't know if they're playing games with us, if they're squeezing 3 cabbages together, but this is probably virgin muck grown. But look, have you ever seen a cabbage that size? I mean, that could feed a village.
In a lot.
By the way, what was the nickname of the Largo athletic teams?
Packers.
The Packers. Not because of meat packing, but more citrus and so.
Yeah.
This is the lettuce grove in Bartow, and note the spelling of lettuce.
I can't see it.
Lettus.
Thank you.
And this is one of the more interesting food stories in Florida. The only Japanese settlement in Florida was near today's Boca Raton and was called Yamato, the ancient name for Japan. And a man named Murakami organized this, and it was very successful as an agricultural colony. It disintegrated after Pearl Harbor, obviously. But how many of you have visited the Murakami gardens there? It's spectacular gardens.
I've heard of it, but
Beautiful.
This is what swamp cabbage looks like, by the way.
Oh, wow.
wow.
this is Tupelo honey. And this is the mango groves of Pineland Island. And this is fascinating. This is about 1910. I didn't have the date there. We think of avocado toast as something millennials imposed upon us. This is 1910 Florida. They're talking about, we need to serve more avocados. And you think, have you been to Delray Beach lately? How are those agricultural festivals these days? Not so hot. But Clearwater, Largo, most of Pinellas County was agricultural before it was urban. Moving into fish, one of my favorite topics. This is, what fish is this, Marshall? That would be the mullet, yes. No protein, no fish served more Floridians for a longer time than mullet. Mullet was the poor people's staple in Florida. It seemed, in fact, this is a word I'll be using again and again, it seemed inexhaustible. That you can't possibly depopulate mullet. There are just too many of them. And I took this in Ybor City about 35 years ago. Good luck finding a mullet dinner for $1.75. And this is a proper smoked mullet. I mean, this is from Ted Peters, I think.
Yeah.
Find someone who knows what they're doing, because this is an art. You have to tap the dark arts to find that. If you don't cook it long enough, it's mushy. And mullet, because of its working class affinities, has always been kind of disparaged. You don't find mullet at five-star restaurants. So the mullet industry in the 1960s said, we need to rebrand mullet, kind of like the classic Coke. Let's get a new name. The Portuguese name for mullet is Lisa. Mm-hmm. And so they called it Lisa. It was disaster. By the way, this really sounds like a bad mullet loaf. I just don't know if that's going to work or not. And this is the high altar of smoked mullet. Ted Peters, after World War II, GIs came back and, I want to just get a job. I'd like to go in business for myself. And for about $30, you could go into the smoked fish business. You needed a few barrels, the day's catch, and some wood. The wood is very argumentative, by the way. There are three types of wood, and each one will get a counter argument. Oak, hickory, and what's the third? Apparently the aficionados claim only the third is the wood you should.
Cedar?
Buttonwood, which is a mangrove wood grown in kind of from this area south. But Ted Peters started with a roadside stand, and the smell sells the thing. This can have Clearwater. So what's the distinctive fish of Clearwater? And the fact that there's a fish and chips in downtown, there was in the 1960s and 70s. Anyone remember that? That they were serving cod, which is obviously not a Gulf Coast fish. But I'd love to know what the fish fry was. It probably, red snapper. It could have been mullet. It could have been grouper, depending on the catch. Yes?
Just to let you know, we actually had our fish fry last week.
Oh, yes. And the fish, fish served was?
Catfish and tilapia.
Okay.
Oh, no. I wish you hadn't told me that. Tilapia is one of these late 20th century foods. I'll talk about my so the proper sandwich in Florida is the grouper. I think everyone would agree. Now, this was Rick Bragg wrote about the grouper. Is there anyone here who's never had a grouper sandwich? I mean, grouper is ubiquitous now, but it wasn't always. This will show you how lonely I am that I'm reading the 1917 St. Petersburg Independent newspaper. But I find it's still the most, I think, amazing discovery. The editorial, this wasn't just an article, it was an editorial called Eat Grouper, which caught my eye. And it's fascinating. Can you read or would it? In St. Petersburg, there's one way to beat the high cost of living. That way is to eat grouper and grits. By the way, I've never seen that on a menu. Has anyone ever seen grouper and grits? The 2 G's will be made palatable and can be cooked in enough varieties to keep them from destroying appetites. Residents of St. Petersburg know all about grits, which is curious, which means in 1917, St. Petersburg was a southern town, which I think you would agree it is not today. For the first time in the history of St. Petersburg, grouper has found a market this winter. In the fish markets all over the city this season, grouper has been sold regularly. Grouper used to be so despised that the fish houses would not buy it. They could find no market. Thousands of pounds were thrown away each week. In reality, grouper, if properly cooked, is as good as any fish. So this is kind of a class discussion, but there's no class. What does this mean? Well, it means obviously that grouper wasn't the go-to fish. It seemed even more scorned than mullet. Thus the question, how did grouper become, I think most would agree, the #1 fish on the menu in Florida? The answer, well, first of all, you said, give me some more evidence of this, right? So this is a 1940 seafood advertisement in Miami. It's fascinating, by the way, the prices. Lobster is the most expensive. This would probably Florida lobster, 45 cents a pound. Stone crabs, 35 cents a pound. Stone crab would cost you $25 a pound now, I'm guessing. Turtle, which is off, 45 cents a pound. Kingfish, 25 cents. Grouper is 10 cents a pound, the same price as mullet. Grouper and mullet. You will pay today for black grouper $25 for fillets. Wow. What? So
frog legs are the most
yeah,
expensive.
frog leg. Isn't that interesting? Probably from the Everglades. This is 1953. Mullet is 19 cents a pound. Pompano is 65 cents a pound. Grouper isn't even on the advertisement. If you had guessed before 1960, pompano, red snapper, maybe kingfish, those were the premium fish, which leads to the question, how did grouper become popular? And this guy supplied the answer. This was one of my favorite friends. His name was Buster Agliano in Italian, 4th generation fishmonger. And we would go on tours. I'd take groups, and the first stop would be the Agliano Fish Market. And he posed a fascinating question. He said, what's the name of your first name of your fishmonger? And most people, they said, well, the kid at Publix. And he said, you trust the kid at Publix to sell you fish? You think he knows the answer? Where is this fish from? How old is it? You need to befriend a fishmonger. And the fishmonger is a vanished institution. There are a couple left. But I asked him about the question about grouper. He said, well, I can tell you precisely. In the early 60s, the food writer from the Tampa Tribune came by and says, Buster, all the housewives are complaining that kingfish, pompano, red snapper are too expensive. Isn't there an alternative? He said, people should eat more grouper. It's cheap, it's plentiful. One of the reasons grouper may be so popular tells you a lot about the American palate. It's not very fishy tasting, is it? And we think of that. We don't like strong flavors often. And grouper can absorb the flavors of everything. It also makes a perfect sandwich. Because, as Buster said, kid, if you put grouper on a bun with tartar sauce, lettuce, tomato, you think the grouper is the determining ingredient? But Agliano Fish Market is now a trinket store. If mullet fed it was the fish for poor people. Oysters were the mollusk for poor people. Oysters have fed more people more protein than any other meat or fish. This is Turtle Mound, the largest Indian mound in Florida, in Volusia County. It's made of dirt and mainly oysters, oyster shells. Think of how many millions and millions of oyster shells over many, many years and the labor required to build them. There was an Indian mound in downtown Tampa, what would be downtown Tampa, and they leveled it to use as road fill because of oyster shells. Christopher Still, your neighbor from Tarpon Springs. This is kind of an homage to the oyster, the tongers. I have another PowerPoint called The 10 Worst Jobs in Florida History. And being an oyster shucker was probably one of the 10 worst jobs. Imagine doing this for 8 hours a day. Would you ever get the smell off your hands and the injuries because of the knives? I mean, wow. Oysters also provide a cautionary parable, a cautionary tale. So for thousands of years, we just ate oysters in abundance and never, again, they're inexhaustible. What could possibly happen? In St. Petersburg, by the way, the principal oyster beds were Big Bayou, along Big Bayou. And they were considered fabulous. And in 1945, there was a prohibition on eating oysters because the waters were tainted. We were dumping most of our sewage into Tampa Bay. Almost all the coastal communities were dumping there. This happened through the 50s even. And there will be consequences. And this is one of my favorite stories. Ozona is not far away. But Ozona was one of the last working class beach communities, where as late as the 40s and 50s, you could live close to the water in Ozona. Those days are long gone. And so this tale, the reporter found a local bait shop owner. He said, this place was a paradise until last year. I could go out with a bucket, and in 5 minutes I had dinner. I could get shrimp, oysters, fish, and then they started dredging Finger Islands in Dunedin. And it's all silt now, and everything's gone. Fernandina was the shrimp capital of the world, along with St. Augustine, for a long time. That's gone as well. We overfished. Stone crabs. Was it not a brave man who ate the first stone crab? I mean, first of all, what do you do with this strange-looking creature? And what's interesting about it, this may be the only sustainable seafood because you don't kill the animal. Now you have to rip the claw off. And the what?
How did they find that out? That it wouldn't die?
That's a good question. I don't know. I'll get back to you on that. Hello. This is a great story. An Orthodox Jew opened Joe Stone Crab in Miami Beach, but there's almost nothing like this. That this institution buys something like 60% of the stone crabs harvested in Florida. How many of you have been to Joe Stone Crab? I mean, this would be an expensive first date dinner. I mean, we're talking stone crabs are not. Have you ever seen a fresh Florida lobster that size? I mean, this is in the Florida Keys as well. 2 of them, no less. Turtle was once a big industry in Florida. Don't ask where those turtles are going. The strangest mollusk must be the conch. I mean, again, who had the idea that this slug-like creature inside a queen conch can be harvested? And how many of you have ever cleaned a conch? When we were in the Bahamas, a buddy of mine, you could still dive near the shore and find queen conchs, but you have to drill 2 holes in it. Then you have to crack the shell and pull the mollusk out. And if you ate it, it would break your teeth. You then have to skin it. And after skin, you have this beautiful glistening white meat, which is still pretty tough. Generally, people, you pound it, it's called cracked conch. You put it in a gumbo. Almost 100% of the conch we eat now comes from the Cayman Islands. This is a conch. Riviera Beach was settled by Bahamians, who called themselves conchs. Back to Jacques Lemoyne, the movie to be made. Lemoyne recalled women sowing corn, planting corn there, and he obviously didn't take notes. And what's interesting about this is the first illustration of agriculture in the New World. The Europeans saw, and almost everything about it is wrong, except the women did do the agricultural work. What's wrong? There are 3 things wrong with it.
You've got a metal tool.
Yeah, the tools are wrong. They did use shells and things like that, but that looks more like a spade.
Are those women nude?
They are, but we don't. Maybe I don't know. But it's not the women; it's the hair. That's Renaissance hair.
Curly hair.
And in fact, I'll show you the next image if you want a contrast to this. So get a good look at the hair. And this is Botticelli's Primavera. Seriously, at almost the same time.
They didn't use straight rows, did they?
And that's the third thing is Europeans plowed straight rows. That's very organized. The Indian method was ingenious. They planted in mounds. So you had a mound of dirt. You put some dead fish in for fertilizer. You then put 3 seeds in, called the 3 sisters. Mm-hmm. What were the seeds? Corn, beans, and squash. The beans re-nourished the soil with nitrogen, and they wrapped around the corn, so you had 3 crops picked at once. I mean, it's brilliant.
It's too funny.
This was a state in the 19th century, and really probably until mid-century, 20th century, that was a corn-eating. I still use my Midwestern corn-eating state. Imagine that Tampa would have a corn grist mill. This is 1948 now. 7,000 pounds an hour. So 3.5 tons of corn were ground into grits every hour. That's astonishing, the amount of that. And look at the size. I think this is like a 3-ton griststone. And it's probably in someone's patio today. I mean, and talk about a vanished institution. So in 1930, you'd drive along the road in North Florida and you'd see black women selling grits fanners. And so these you would have shelled the corn yourself, and then you would have ground it yourself, but they're the chaff on the outside, which is indigestible. When you eat popcorn, you get the stuff between your teeth. That's kind of chaff. And so you toss it gently, the ground corn in the air, and the wind will blow away the chaff, much like you would do with wheat. You think, you wonder how many grits fanners are left in someone's attic. Oh, I'd do anything to go back and interview Ethel Taylor. First of all, look at her forearms. She could be a shot putter. I mean, this is pretty amazing. But look at that. That must be a 40-pound bag of grits, which indicates how generally you ate grits a couple times a day. And there's a whole debate whether what you put on, whether butter, etc. We'll get to that in a second. But grits by themselves are kind of boring. So you would also make cornbread from the cornmeal. But cornbread by itself can be boring day after day. So this is crackling bread. So what would be in with it?
Bacon.
Pork cracklings or chicken fat, things like that. Every granddaughter inherited a cast iron skillet that you made cornbread in. This is actually a true headline. And it's fascinating to talk to students in class. I mean, it's hard to imagine now. But our diets were much more rigid then. Maybe not. But if you ate biscuits every day of your mother made you biscuits every day of your life, and you married someone who only liked sliced bread, this could be a problem. And it became a problem, obviously. Chitlin bread. Now, this is not everyone's favorite. You all know what chitlins are, right? Pig intestines. And the story behind this is fascinating. D.B. McKay, who's one of Tampa's royalty, he was 5-time mayor, owned the afternoon newspaper. He had seen everything. And he's going out hunting one day, probably 1910, and they come across a black preacher's home. But it's Sunday, he's at service, so they go inside, and there's a platter of chitlin bread. And he began crying. Why do you think? Because that's what his mammy made him when he was a young kid. And it's like the rosebud illusion. How many of you know what Georgia ice cream is? Oh, I'm so disappointed.
Has that something to do with peaches?
No.
No?
I'm so disappointed. I thought this was a more sophisticated group. Georgia ice cream is cornbread and buttermilk. And you together, and of course, what's the debate? There's fierce debate over how to eat. Do you drink it or eat it? Do you use a spoon, or do you put it in a bowl or drink it? But this was really good. It's cornbread and buttermilk. Is that what I said?
Yes.
And buttermilk.
Is it on the menu somewhere?
I've never seen it. Maybe in Dalton, Georgia.
Yeah.
The greatest food revolution in history occurs when Columbus steps ashore in 1492. This is called by historians the Columbian Exchange. Modernization, globalization begins on a massive scale then. Diseases, but also transformations of diet. One way of looking at this, so in 1492, no Italian had ever eaten a pizza with tomato on it. No Chinese had ever eaten a Szechuan pepper. No Hungarian had ever eaten a paprika pepper. No Irishman had eaten a stew with potatoes in it. All those ingredients, every pepper in the world originated in Mexico or Central America. Corn is from America. Potatoes are from the Andes. But it worked both ways. From Europe and Asia and Africa came pigs, horses, cattle, chickens, wheat, a lot of root crops. Most of the apples, cherries from the New World, chocolate, corn, potatoes, cocaine.
Coffee.
No, coffee is actually from Africa. It's complicated. There's a different variety of coffee called Arabica, is the good coffee, Robusta beans, but they weren't drinking that. So this really revolutionized, and it's still going on. I mean, think about this: the supermarket of today versus 40 years ago. Would you find a jicama 40 years ago? Vietnamese spinach. I mean, the international aisle 40 years ago was probably soy sauce. Cattle came to Florida. In some ways, Florida has as much frontier ranching traditions as Texas, except they were Spaniards in Texas as well, but here they were crackers. These are cracker cowboys. Distinct, this is Frederick Remington drew these in the late 19th century. So, but it's a different type of cowboy. They didn't have pistols, they had rifles. The hat is not the 10-gallon hat. This is more utilitarian. The rain will run off it. Those are called marsh tackies, the ponies. They're smaller than the Texas horses. You don't use a lasso in Florida. You use a cur dog. Other edibles, the Florida gopher, which now protected, but they were called in the Great Depression Hoover chickens. In fact, I'm not making this up. There's a great debate going on in Pensacola in the 1930s. There was a tradition in Pensacola. On Fridays, the Catholics in Pensacola would eat gopher gumbo. And a Protestant minister brought up the question, shouldn't Catholics not eat meat on Friday? And gopher is not a fowl or a fish. So the Catholic bishop said, yes, it is, and solved the debate. But this was widely eaten in Florida. The land tortoise is what it is. Other things, possums were eaten. Alex Sink, that many of you know, a candidate for governor, ate possum growing up in North Carolina. Catherine Harris did not. I think that's well understood. But apparently she did sample possum and she lost the election. Oranges. Probably the most famous postcard in Florida history. Wish you were here with oranges. What's interesting about this is a very old postcard. Those are not classic oranges in advertisements today. Those have a little rust on them. Those were picked on trees and not cleaned up. This is what a Florida tree in many places would have looked like in the late 19th century. They're not classically grown. They're much taller. Talk about a vanished institution, the shipping shed, where you bring all the oranges, you would wash them, you would put them in tissues, and then put them in a variety of, depending on their quality, and ship them by rail or steamboat. But the mule on the lower right would take them to market. When's the last time you've seen a mule in Florida? What's the old line? You can always tell a Faulkner, if it's a Faulkner novel, the mule dies. That's a big deal. Mules were expensive. They're stronger than horses, live longer than horses. But the packing shed is a vanished institution. If you were here as late as the 70s in Florida, you can remember going to up 19 in Hillsborough on 301 or 41 and seeing oranges. So there'd be scores of roadside stands offering fresh orange juice, free orange juice if you come in, probably picked there. You have to love the citrus art. This is, I just love, when's the last time you've seen an advertisement using a razorback hog? Or a Neapolitan contadina? Again, the comparisons to the Mediterranean. Or Cracker Girl. Which would probably be politically incorrect now, but that's a wholesome sapsucker. When's the last time you had thought about a sapsucker or woodpecker? And Clearwater, the most famous orange crate label in Clearwater history. There were groves here. Did you see many groves when you drove in? In fact, there's not, I believe, a single working grove left in Clearwater. The last one was near Indian Rocks. I think that's astonishing. As late as 1950, Pinellas County was one of the top 5 counties in citrus. Wow. It's started picking tourists and condos. I think this may be the last image of Jacques Lemoyne, but Jacques Lemoyne also the first image of barbecue. The word barbecue came from a Caribbean Indian word, barbacoa, which is also the Spanish word for barbecue, barbacoa. But we still mangle the word today. When you say, I'm going to barbecue, barbecue is not a verb, it's a noun. Barbecue is the process. But barbacoa, wasn't even the process then. The word barbacoa originally meant the grids, the steaks going over that you cooked upon. But and those are that's some interesting protein, by the way. I'm not sure. I mean, it's lizards.
Wow.
What is that animal right in the middle? Is that a deer? Would that be a deer?
I think so, yes.
Or like
And there's some proof, by the way, that Lemoyne may have plagiarized other artists in this time. And this one in particular, some people think it's actually originally in Venezuela, but regardless. This is a proper barbecue. Again, you won't see this anymore. This is, the only white man here is the pitmaster, and he's supervising probably several tons of pork and beef done. You can see they dug a pit for this. And if you were a politician until recently, you had to go to a barbecue. And the idea of not eating, and this is Governor Fuller Warren, who looks like he's been to a few barbecues. Fuller Warren was from Bluntstown on the Apalachicola River. Terrible governor, but a good eye for barbecue. This is proper barbecue. This is actually South Carolina. Lynn and I were there. Talk about a vanished institution, whole hog barbecue, where you're literally, you have two sides of the hog that you've properly dressed, and it takes about 12, 14 hours. Who has the time? I mean, think of that. It's an all-night thing if you're going to serve the next day. There's very few places willing to do that. And you have to mop it, literally with a mop. This is probably, in South Carolina, vinegar. There's vinegar and mustard in South Carolina. Generally, most of the barbecue here is the Georgia style, kind of the sweet sour sauce. And you don't think of Clearwater as being a barbecue town, do you? Right? I'm going to Clearwater for some great barbecue. This is, any idea of the date? This is Young's Barbecue on Gulf to Bay Boulevard.
It was here in '72.
Is that right?
Now it's Rumbus.
It's a very good transformation.
Seafood, very good seafood.
Okay.
Looks like a bad weather day.
Yes.
Afternoon.
Yes.
Miami, you don't think of Miami as a barbecue place, but this is from Fortune magazine. Had an amazing artist, if you ever, these 1930s magazines, but look at the Smitty's Barbecue. I trust any place called Smitty's. And, I must have taken it out. The image I took out, the hottest, anyone know where the hottest barbecue is today in Florida? It's
Spicy.
Little Haiti in Miami.
Oh.
It's a Haitian barbecue. But why is Little Haiti the hottest real estate market? Some have argued in the north, on the east coast of the U.S. Yes.
It's above sea level?
Yes. It's the highest elevation in Miami, and businesses are now saying we have to think 50, 75 years down. How do you know that? I'm impressed.
Environmental stuff.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Right.
I wish I could interview this guy. First of all, the mustache. Which is better, the mustache or the chef's hat? The baker's hat. But look at this, and of course, it looks like what's that dripping from that's palmetto leaf. It's from the saw palmetto, and it's a huge debate. Here, I'll show you. There's a better image here. There. So you harvest the palmetto leaves, the green leaves, soak them in water, and you put them on the wet dough. And there's a huge debate. It apparently doesn't affect the taste. The best explanation I heard from an old Cuban baker that the old ovens were very uneven, and the temperature gauges. So you look at the color of the palmetto leaf. If it was a certain shade of brown, you knew the bread was ready. This is the most iconic fusion food is one of those words now. That was what the Columbian Exchange was about, fusion food. So black beans are native to the Caribbean and Cuba. Rice is native to Asia, brought by the Moors to Spain. Moros y Cristianos, Moors and Christians, the comical word for black beans and rice.
Wow.
Tostones, that's plantains, but mostly you would simply slice them up and fry them. But if you're having guests, you mash the plantains and you had a little cookie cutter, a diameter of a circle, and you'd press out the plantains and fry them in those imperfect circles. Crab, there's huge debate over the pronunciation. This is Spanish, Italian, but it's hard to believe that in those days, 30s and 40s, you could go out with a chicken neck and string and catch 3 dozen crabs in an hour or less. Now, shelling them would take longer, but you'd put the fresh crab meat in with the spaghetti sauce, and you would serve it. And it's not a first date. I mean, it is so messy. I mean, the spaghetti, cracking the shells with the tomato sauce on it, but it's a very flavorful dish. Flan is one of those things, when prepared well, is so good, but it's rarely well anymore. I mean, but great flan is divine. It's a custard, is what it is. Oh, to go back and interview this guy at Pepe's Cafe, 1938. This guy was a young kid during the Cuban Revolution of the 1860s.
Was that Miami? Or?
This is Key West.
Oh,
Key West.
Yeah, thanks.
Look at that little tail. I mean, just his hat. I love this. This is one of my favorite photos. So it's Key West, 1945, and it begins. There are 3 signs: Havana, boat, air, bus. Taking the bus from Key West to Havana may be problematic, but I'm guessing that's when you arrived at Sidewalk Cafe. American and Spanish, excellent coffee. Now, a number of us have been to Spain. Spanish coffee, what exactly is Spanish coffee? What do you think they meant? It's not really Spanish coffee.
Arabic.
They meant Cuban coffee.
Oh.
But if you called it Spanish coffee, it's more continental. Cuban coffee seems more working class. But the best part is, there's a sign, turtle burger sandwich. You can buy a turtle burger, ground up turtle meat on a bun in Key West. This was the greatest cafe in Ybor City, not Colombia, but Las Novedades, means the novelties. And it was El Goya, for those of you in the 1960s and 70s, a gay club. And it's gone. It ended in 1977. But it was considered the best. But again, talk about vanished institutions. If you were here in 1978, 77, there were still about 6 classic Spanish cafes where the waiters were all 70, and they didn't start waiting until they were 40s because they were busboys. And the dish to prepare was broiled pompano. And they'd come with a knife and a fork and debone it. Try that at home, by the way. See how that goes. But just the elegance of... So you had the Colombia, Las Novedades. You had Spanish Park, which was really something. The Spanish Park had these great murals. You had Pepe's, was another. Pepin's in St. Petersburg. Alvarez. I wouldn't call that classic.
I wouldn't.
But it was great. Alvarez was... God, I love Alvarez. I must have eaten there 40 times. It's now, I think, an ice cream shop or something. It's the one we're leaving out, of course, is Valencia on Kennedy. I mean, these were all iconic, and only the Columbia remains. when Richard, I occasionally do a tag team with Richard Gonsmart, the owner, and so I asked a question for the audience. Why did they call it the 1905 salad? Because that's when Columbia began. Except 35 years ago, I'm looking at the December 1903 Tampa Morning Tribune, top of the page. What?
Who wouldn't?
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, hey, it's what guys do. And the top of the page was the Wright brothers' flight in North Carolina. But then there's this, says opening of Columbia Cafe, 22nd Avenue. But it's not 1905, it's 1903. So I copied it, sent it to the owner, who was then Cesar Gonsmart, who, again, as iconic a figure, kissing the hands of the ladies when they would come in, played the violin at your table. So I said to him, I said, I have good news and bad news for you. The good news is you may be around to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Columbia. The bad news, you're going to have to rebrand the 1905 salad as the 1903 salad. And he writes me back and says, kid, I never met him. He said, kid, I got too much invested in the 1905 salad. I'll give you a free meal if you'll throw this away. Never got my free meal. So Richard then, I'm the warm-up for Richard. Richard comes out and said, well, a few years ago, when the price of tomatoes spiked, we stopped putting tomatoes on the 1905 salad. And when patrons would complain, I would say, you don't understand. You're eating the 1903 salad. Now this is kind of interesting. Match the most iconic soup in Ybor City. Match the soup in the city. And of course, if I just told you, so here's this city in the southeastern U.S., very hot and humid, settled by Spaniards. There's only one answer. Gazpacho, right? I mean, gazpacho is the soup for a hot day. Gazpacho was never on the menu in Ybor City. It wasn't added to the Columbia, I think, until 20 years ago. And why is that? Because the Spaniards in Ybor City were not from southern Spain. No. That's where gazpacho originated. They were from northwestern Spain. Cold, clammy, mountainous. They want bold, hearty, gusto soups. This is the proper soup in Ybor City, even in the summer. You think about it, if your grandmother made it for you, you probably like it. That's your go-to soup. This is caldo gallego. Gallego, G-A-L-L-E-G-O, means someone from Galicia, which is a province in northwestern Spain. And this has ham stock, potatoes, it has collard greens, it has chorizo, it has chunks of ham from a ham hock,
Beans.
and Great Northern beans. How many of you have eaten? Oh God, it's the best soup. It is the best soup ever.
Does Columbia serve this?
Still, I think Spanish bean soup is more popular, but this I think is more iconic. Almost through. So I've left out, of course, the most important dessert in Florida history. But the history, again, this is almost movie worthy. So imagine you're living in the Middle Keys, Isla Morada, in 1860s, 1870s. You are so isolated. There's no transportation over land because there are just scores of islands. On the one hand, you have the greatest selection of fish anyone in history maybe has ever consumed. You can have each night a prize when we pay $100 for. The problem is the soil is rocky. There's almost no topsoil there, so you can't grow crops. You have no vegetables there. The only thing that grows well there is a key lime tree. Key lime trees need very low roots. So you have everyone has a key lime tree. No one has a cow. Cows would die of malnutrition, but everyone has chickens. Chickens are resourceful. So now you have two ingredients. You have lime juice, key lime juice, and you have eggs. And what's missing all this is a dessert, because it's almost impossible to keep wheat flour there. It's hot, it's humid, the flour's going to mold. So no one, it's very hard to bake bread or have a pie crust. So the great search is on. And by the way, the Keys folks would use key limes the way we would use Tabasco sauce or ketchup. You would squeeze it into a bottle. You'd pour about a tablespoon of salt to preserve it, and this would last for years, as long as you. And they call it Old Sour. They put it on your fish, even. So two products emerge in the 1860s, almost back to back. In New York, Gail Borden has managed to can milk. What he's done is evaporate milk, put it into a can, which will last years. The problem, though, is the milk bacteria start growing in the cans. Not good. And the next year, he puts sugar in the sugar retards bacteria. So sweetened condensed milk. So now you can get cans of sweetened condensed milk in the Florida Keys. So you have a custard, but you don't have a pie shell. That year, Sylvester Graham out of Battle Creek, Michigan, along with Dr. Kellogg, he is kind of a health nut. And one of the things he's telling us, correctly, white bread will kill you. Refined white bread is terrible. So he creates a cracker of kind of whole grains called the Graham cracker. And it's in envelopes. So you can use it in the Keys. It's not going to grow moldy. So now you have the perfect solution. You have the basis for key lime pie. You think about it. You make a bakeless crust of butter, or so you have the graham crackers, and you put water even, and you crust them up so you've got the crust. You don't need to bake it. The custard is very easy. So you take a can of sweetened condensed milk, an egg yolk, and you stir it. And it's a beautiful kind of yellow color. You put it in. You don't have to bake it. And you can use the egg white as a meringue. Most people don't have broilers, but you don't need a broiler. So the key lime pie is invented. No one knows when, how. If you were there in the 1940s, you would stop by. 5 cents a slice, by the way. I bet in Key West today you would pay $8 to $10 for a slice. And now they drizzle caramel and stuff on it. But every housewife did. I believe this is the place. Jeff Klinkenberg told me the story. He wrote a story in the Times in the 1980s, the greatest key lime pie in Florida. And he went up and talked to the waitress was the owner. You had key lime trees in back. And she just erupted. I don't want a store. I don't want people from St. Petersburg coming here. I'm working myself to death. The last thing I need is more customers. So Jeff writes the article anyway. And it happens, a couple is honeymooning in the Keys. And he gives them the article. He said, will you go by and give it to her? And they said they looked at her and she was in the aisle and she smiled and she was reading the article. But these are vanished institutions.
Yeah.
I mean, no, that can't be. Okay. That's how key lime pie was created. We have time for questions? Probably not. We do. Any questions? Anyone want to correct me? Yes.
I have a question. Was the Cuban sandwich invented in Ybor City?
I have a colleague. That is a much more complicated. No, that's the easy answer. You should actually invite him. Andy Hughes, Huse. Andy has a book coming out on the history of the Cuban sandwich, and he's doing it with a Cuban scholar. And now with newspaper searches, he has Spanish language papers from Cuba from the 1860s. Talking about the Cuban sandwich. This is 30 years before Ybor City. And there was a lonchero, I think is the name. Lonchero. For, it was a pride. If you've ever been to Spain, in Spain they don't slice the ham there. These are Iberico hams that are really expensive. You have a guy with this long knife, it looks almost like a bread knife, slicing it so thin. I think they're called loncheros. But they were making the Cuban sandwich. It was considered kind of a delicacy there. The Cuban sandwich here probably began, most of the workers in the early years of Ybor City were Cubans and Spaniards. The Italians hadn't arrived yet. And most of them were single. It was a frontier town. And most of them lived in boarding houses without kitchens. So they ate out, and they typically would go after work to a tavern. This is a saloon in the 19th century was kind of a working man's club. It's where you got jobs. Someone would tell you, you should meet my sister. And the deal was, if you bought a beer, you could eat a sandwich there. And they had on the bar Cuban bread, ham, baked ham. They probably baked there, already sliced. Whether they had salami or not is the problematic ingredient. But there's all sorts of other problems. Whether you grill it first, you press it or not. But you can imagine the birth of the Cuban sandwich from there. And then as people started, cafes started offering Cuban sandwiches. So that's a compressed history. What was the last great? What was the name of the place?
La Teresita.
Well, Teresita was good. I'm trying to think. This was only Cuban sandwiches on 7th Avenue, and they opened a chain in Riverview. It's
Mercados?
No. But the controversy today is, who, between Miami and Tampa, who deserves the title of the originator? Clearly, I think it begins earlier in Tampa. The problem the Miamians have is the salami. The dumbest idea, by the way, you probably have heard this on public radio. Someone from the Columbia actually says this, that the Cuban sandwich was invented. The groups got together, the Cubans, a Cuban, an Italian, a Spaniard, meet at a bar, right? But also a German and a Jew. There were very few German, but there were Romanian Jews in Ybor. All the Jews in Ybor City were from Romania who had spent time in Cuba, and they knew Spanish. It was very interesting migration there. And they said, let's create a sandwich that represents kind of the UN of Ybor City. Food doesn't arrive that way. So the Cubans had roast pork. The Italians had salami, which the Miamians call pepperoni, by the way. There is no such thing as pepperoni in Italy, by the way. If you order pepperoni pizza, they'll bring a pizza with peppers. At any rate, the Jews had the pickle. Who am I leaving out? The Spaniards had
Bread?
No, the Cubans had the bread. The Spaniards brought the roast pork. That's crazy. That is just nuts. But we'll never find an article, the Cuban sandwich. The Washington Post did a story on Ybor City a few years ago, and someone from the Ybor City Society actually said, I found in the Ybor factory a recipe for a Cuban sandwich. But he's never showed it to me. But the Cuban bread is perfect for that if it's fresh Cuban bread. The next day it's terrible. Mm-hmm. But it's a perfect bread for toasting or for sandwiches.
Is there a group of Cuban?
Or a group of Cuban, yes. Yes.
I'm just curious about the sweet potato connection with Calatisi Island and Myrtle and all that too. How she used to have sweet potatoes growing on the island.
The Caladisi thing, let me tell another Caladisi story. Is the woman who, that's not you. No. I thought, someone who often cuts, Terry Fortner. Terry Fortner. I had you misidentified. Terry tells the story. Her grandmother was the only resident, her family was the only family living there. Her father was from Switzerland, and they were living there alone in the late 19th, early 20th century. Imagine that. And in the interview, the woman, no, the daughter wrote a book about living on Caladesi Island. And one of the food stories was she went to school in Dunedin. And she rode, as a kid, she rode across St. Joseph Sound in a rowboat to go to school. And her mother prepared every day a cold kind of cake of grits, but a cold stone crab. And students made fun of her, saying, "Oh, white trash, you're eating stone crabs." Well, you can imagine that. So, but I'm unaware of the sweet potato. I must admit, you caught me unprepared. So sweet potatoes, were they grown commercially?
On the gardens.
Okay, in the garden, but not, okay. Sweet potatoes will grow almost anywhere. I'm not surprised. And they're, if you know anything about nutrition, sweet potatoes are incredibly nutritious. Mm-hmm. So if you're living on an island, your food choices are rather limited. So a sweet potato would be an ideal food in terms of nutritional value. You think of that, I thought you were going, often the debate in Florida is, what should be, if we had this on a vote, what's the official state pie? We know it's key lime. But I think there would be two other contenders. Sweet potato pie, particularly African Americans and poor whites. But what would, in North Florida, near the Georgia-Alabama border? Pecan, or pecan. Yeah, pecan. Now, I think key lime pie would win easily. When we were in New Mexico a few years ago, there's New Mexico, I think Florida should have this. New Mexico has an official state question. You have official state birds and rodents. In New Mexico, the official state question is red or green. Chile, and they also have an official state pronunciation. It's not Chile, it's Chile. The official, but or Christmas, both of them combined. What would the official state question of Florida be? How much? Are you kidding me? You expect me to believe this?
What about the great delicatessens that were in the Miami area?
Yeah, that's a group I haven't mentioned. Miami had a large Jewish population. Tampa had, actually what's interesting about the Tampa Jewish community, almost they were Romanians and Germans. Almost all the German Jews belonged to the German club, called the German American Club. The building is still there on 7th Avenue. It's north of Centro Asturiano. It's a stately building, and half the membership was German Jew, which people find shocking given what happened in the 1930s and 40s. But German Jews were very proud to be Germans. This is kind of the golden age. You have music and literature and the academy and sciences. During World War I, there's this intense anti-German and xenophobia because of the Hun. And the government shut down the German club. And ironically, 4 years later, it was the Hebrew club. And then it became kind of a YMCA type. But to Miami, Miami had a huge Jewish population. Talk about an incident, if you wanted a what if, or the most painful incident in Florida history. 1939, the USS, no, it's a German boat. No, the SS St. Louis, with 900 German refugees. They first pull up in Havana. Havana said, we don't want you. German agents had arrived earlier. They come to Miami, surely America, and they're turned away. Franklin Roosevelt refuses to, and most of them died in the Holocaust. But after the Holocaust, there's a huge migration of Jews, elderly Jews from New York, the Northeast there. The great writer Isaac Singer lived in Miami Beach. So it's interesting. In the book I did on Florida, I talked about old age in Florida, and there was a photograph of the cornerstone of a building called the Hebrew Old Age Society. Their elderly Jews went there. It's now French Canadians and Cubans who are the new old age in Florida. She was an extraordinary contribution to Miami in terms of philanthropy, leadership there. There was a Jewish community called Shenandoah before World War II, and next door was the birthplace, you could argue the most famous Floridian of World War II, lived in Miami. His mother, her maiden name was Gay, G-A-Y.
Enola Gay.
Paul Tibbets. Paul Tibbets, he of the Hiroshima fame, infamy, depending on your politics, grew up in Miami. It's a great story. His father was determined he would be a doctor, a very stern father. And Tibbets drops out of the University of Florida to join U.S. Army Air Corps. The father's just furious. The mother said, everything will be fine. And on August 5th, 1945, in Tinian Island, the plane is there, and someone said to him, it's B-29, you don't have a name. Enola Gay, his mother.
Oh.
Nice.
I
Yes.
have another question. What about the papas with the potato salad and Greek salad
You know, that is an interesting story.
and tarpon?
So Tarpon Springs, the Pappas restaurant, very famous for Greek salad. And I'm sure the first time you ate there, if you were from outside, it said potatoes and a salad. It seemed strange. And there's a huge debate whether that's authentically Greek, but it's probably evolution. Potatoes were cheap. Americans like potatoes in everything. So that's more than like, well, I have to huddle with Tina Bukovalis on this. But you know who wrote a story about this in the 1930s? Classic Florida story. So think about this. Couple in love, the marriage is on the rocks in New York. So they say, to save the marriage, let's move to a farm in Florida. 1930, they buy, from her inheritance, they buy a farm not outside Gainesville. And it's Marjorie Kennan Rawlings.
Oh, yeah.
And her husband is named,
That's it.
no, that's her,
Oh, that's her publisher.
her later second
Yeah.
husband.
Okay.
Something Rawlings. Anyway, he writes for Saturday Evening Post an article on Tarpon Springs and elaborates on the Greek salad. By the way, the marriage crumbled and she's left, and greatest writer in Florida history, I think. And she's the author of probably the greatest written cookbook in history. During World War II, she was writing a lot of soldiers. And she's living on the farm in Cross Creek, and she would often lace her letters with talks about what she's fixing that night. And the soldiers were saying, "You're making us hungry. Why don't you write a cookbook?" And she did. It's called Cross Creek Cookery.
Yeah.
I use it in the food class. And there's a recipe for Minorcan, M-I-N-O-R-C-A-N, Minorcan gopher turtle stew. And the first sentence, talk about the simplicity of a simple declarative sentence. The first sentence of the recipe is, decapitate the gopher. And it's decapitate the gopher, cut up the entrails and scald them, and fry them in deep fat. That's for Minorcan gopher stew. Minorca, if you're not familiar, is an island off the east coast of Spain, the Balearic Islands, and the Minorcans are most famous. They came to Florida in 1757 to New Smyrna. The British controlled Florida, and the planter brought 3 groups, almost 1,000 workers. A third of them were Greeks, a third of them were Minorcans, who would not consider themselves Spaniards. It's a very independent group, and a third of them Italians, who would not have considered themselves Italians. They were Genoans. And they brought them, so they couldn't unify and rebel. And in fact, that's exactly what they did. They rebelled, they killed the overseers, and the Minorcans walked from New Smyrna to St. Augustine, several hundred miles, and became kind of a first family in St. Augustine. So most of the Spanish influence in modern St. Augustine is Minorcan. And it's a very distinct food.
Wasn't there a documentary, I think you were in it, on the Menorcans and that particular
Yes.
event when they...
Yeah.
was
And it's
attacked?
interesting, the island is spelled Menorca, Menorca. But in St. Augustine, it's Min, Menorca.
Do you know anything about Basque food in Tampa? And I asked this because I think it was in maybe 2000, 1999, there was a little restaurant that somebody had told me about.
It's on...
Florida, and is it Dale Mabry?
Yeah, and I think I went to that. And it's, you're talking about Basque?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I
And-
had the most divine shrimp scampi. And I get like this when I eat food, that it's just wonderful. I eat it everywhere, like crab cakes. I eat crab cakes. And nothing compares. And that restaurant didn't last very long.
The Craigs and the Morminos had spent a lot of time in Basque country when in Spain. That's a fascinating cuisine. I mean,
Is there any Basque?
I'm unaware of it. And what would you say, Diane? What is a classic Basque dish? Probably would be lamb, but what it's mountain, very mountainous. It's on the French border there, and they have a language. I think it's called Esquera, something very close to that. It's one of the two non-European languages. It's more like Hungarian, Magyar, and they're fiercely independent
Yes.
of Spain.
But they don't have a
Oh,
cohesive community then here.
the high altar of Basque food is what's the name of the community? San Sebastian. It's on the, what's that coast called? The Bay of Biscay. Bay of Biscay. And probably the most distinctive thing today would be tapas. Which
Paella?
paella, I think, is Southern Spanish.
Okay.
But the tapas, with really good ham on bread. But San Sebastian is also one of the most beautiful harbors you will ever see. Kind of a scallop shape there. Yes.
What were some of the foods relating to Cedar Key's history?
Cedar Key, that's incredible fish. That was a very active harbor. If you go to the Island Hotel in Cedar Key, 1850s, the most interesting, you can make an argument, this is the most interesting dish in Florida. It's called the island salad, but it's hearts of palm from the trees growing there. There are lots of palm trees there. So you have hearts of palm, you have lime sherbet, believe it or not. You have pecans, lettuce, and we're missing something. There's a
Tomatoes.
I don't know if there's tomatoes, but definitely try that. But always today, the big thing to try would be clams. They're trying to reinvent themselves. The cedar trees are gone. We've denuded them for pencils, by the way. But in Cedar Key, they're growing clams today, pretty successfully. It's not an easy place to get. I mean, it's from here. It's an hour and a half.
Yeah.
Further.
Yeah.
If it's longer than
It's an interesting airport to land at, too.
It's
a really short.
Yeah, about 3 hours.
Oh, dates. Dates are also in it. Here's a picture. Pass that around if you want, of the island, the salad there.
And I'll give away one other tip. The Island Hotel, the best room is room 29.
Really?
Yeah, it's purported to be haunted. And you'll hear the keys jingling of the ghost every now and then. Been there, done that. And out the back window of your room, you can check your vehicle. If you park it out back with your kayaks on it and all that. An awesome room. And your own bathroom. You don't have to go
29.
down the hall to the community bathroom.
Can we use your name when we go there?
That might get you thrown out.
A few years ago, oysters would have been the answer, but I don't think oysters are good.
They have little cottages outside.
I've been given the hook. So thank you for coming.
Thank you.